Greetings and salutations, my friend. Is gender dysphoria a mental illness? I think it's one of the most important questions to ask whenever talking about the transsexual, transgender issues. Because deep down, I don't think it is about politics. I think it is about psychology. The problem is that the whole problem has become so heavily politicized. Now, let me just say it straight away that I do think that gender dysphoria is a type of mental illness, and I stated it openly already in my detransitioning video, the first I've ever made. Now, what I mean by that is not meant as an offense. It is not meant to belittle people who have gender dysphoria. And I think that the very fact that we think of such a term as mentally ill as a slur tells us how we view mental health and mental illness. And I think that we should destigmatize mental health. I think we should destigmatize mental illness. There is nothing wrong with being mentally ill outside of the problem that that illness brings to you. But I would never look down on someone who's mentally ill. I am mentally ill. There is nothing wrong with that. Let's destigmatize that. Now, why do I think that gender dysphoria is a mental illness? First of all, we have to think, how do we define mental illness? Mental illness is a mental or psychological abnormality that either causes distress or suffering to the person affected by it, or it makes it harder for you to function in society, either at work or with your personal relationships. That's when we consider something a mental illness. There are exceptions to the rule, right? You have personality disorders such as narcissism or sociopathy. Those individuals, they might feel good about themselves, especially narcissists, but it's usually people around them who suffer from that mental illness. You know what I mean? But in general, the rule of the thumb is that the person affected by mental illness will have some level of distress or suffering caused by that illness. If you have ever experienced any level of gender dysphoria throughout your life, whether you had it since early childhood or if it's something you developed in your teenage years, if you went through that, you know how distressing it is. You know that the feeling that you are born in a wrong body, that somehow your sex is wrong, causes a lot of suffering or a lot of distress to the person experiencing it. And again, how much of that distress and suffering you will feel is dependent on a particular individual. There's different degrees of that distress. So someone who had really intense gender dysphoria since their early childhood, someone who attempted to cut off their genitals, would look at someone like me and said, oh, you never had gender dysphoria because you didn't experience what I've experienced. I think it's very individual. I absolutely hated my body. I absolutely hated my genitals. I didn't feel at home in my male body. I do think of that as gender dysphoria to some degree. It caused me distress. It caused me suffering. To some degree, I still experience gender dysphoria. I just don't suffer from it because I moved on. I got better. I learned how to deal with it. It's very clear to me that gender dysphoria falls into this description of mental illness. It is a psychological abnormality that causes distress or suffering, or even makes it hard to function, considering how many people with gender dysphoria don't function well at school when they're growing up with gender dysphoria, and they will not do well at school because of their dysphoria. It will affect their grades, it will affect their personal relationships to some degree. It definitely falls into the category of mental illness. And then let's focus on the first part, which is a psychological abnormality. Well, gender dysphoria is definitely a psychological abnormality. It is not a physical abnormality. There is literally nothing wrong with your body from a purely medical perspective. It is functioning the way it's supposed to. It is doing its job, right? It's your mind that is reading those signals in a wrong way. For that reason, I think that the line between so-called gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia is very, very thin, right? It's like, well, where exactly do you draw that line? Was my hate towards my genitals when I was growing up a gender dysphoria, or was it body dysmorphia? I touched upon that with Buck Angel in the video. I don't know if he invited me to his channel. I don't know if the video is out yet, but I think it's very, very interesting. And sometimes I'm not even sure if there is much of a difference between body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. In fact, I think that gender dysphoria is a type of body dysmorphia. But what exactly is dysphoria? If you Google just dysphoria, not even gender dysphoria, but dysphoria, it says dysphoria or dysphoric mood is a mental state in which a person has a profound sense of unease or dissatisfaction. While not a mental health diagnosis on its own, dysphoria is a symptom associated with a variety of mental illnesses, some of which include stress, anxiety, depression, or substance use disorders. Now, interesting. So it is a symptom of mental illness, because it's not a healthy state to be experiencing any type of dysphoria. Unease and dissatisfaction doesn't sound as dramatic as distress or suffering. That means that the threshold for experiencing of dysphoria is actually very, very low. It just means not being satisfied. That's a very, very low threshold, right? I'm not satisfied with many things. You might not be happy with what your particular body part looks like, but you don't hate it, really. You're just like, well, it could be bad. Is that some sort of dysphoria? Now, let's Google gender dysphoria and see what Google says about it. Gender dysphoria occurs when there is a conflict between the sex you were assigned at birth and the gender with which you identify. This can create significant distress and can make you feel uncomfortable in your body. People with gender dysphoria may want to change the way that they express their gender. No mention of it being a symptom of mental illness. So a dysphoria is a symptom of mental illness, but somehow if you add gender to it, it's not. Interesting. Also, I think it's a simplification of the issue when you say that gender dysphoria is the conflict between the gender you were assigned at birth and the gender you identify as. First of all, gender is not assigned at birth. The doctor observes your sex usually based on your genitals. They don't even check your chromosomes in most cases, unless there's a ambiguity of your genitals. Only in that case they will check your chromosomes. Otherwise, good to go. I'm adding this part as I'm editing the video, and I've noticed that I forgot to mention something important. A lot of people would say that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness because it has a physical reason, physical cause as to why someone would be experiencing gender dysphoria from a young age. And here's my, such as hormonal imbalance, for example, and here's my take on it. Well, a lot of what we consider mental illnesses have underlying physical cause, physical origin, such as chemical imbalance in brain that can cause depression. Bipolar disorder has some physical cause behind it. We can observe it from a neurological perspective, that something is off. That doesn't make it any less of a mental illness, since it doesn't affect your physicality. It affects your psychology. And I think that's the one thing that distinguishes it. So I don't think it matters whether the cause is not psychological, if the cause is physical. The illness is still psychological, if that makes sense. Just to clarify. And I don't even think it is a conflict between the assigned gender and gender identity. I don't believe in gender identity. I do believe in gender. What I mean by that is that it is the psychological aspect of being the sex you are. And sometimes, yes, there might be a conflict between gender and sex. And that is pretty much a mental health problem, right? It is a psychological abnormality. But I don't think it's identity. because I don't think you can choose what gender you identify as. It is not up to you. And let's say someone who's trans, someone who transitioned, someone who truly feels that they are the opposite gender. They didn't choose that. They didn't choose to identify as the opposite gender. What would they have to gain from that? Other than a much tougher life, to be honest. Well, you live a pretty rough life if you're trans. Unless, of course, you want more points on the victim hierarchy, of course. But it's not something you choose. I think it really simplifies the issue. Now, another interesting thing I've noticed is that when you Google gender dysphoria, the first picture that shows up, at least for me, is this one. It says, signs of gender dysphoria. And some of these are indeed correct, like wish to have the sex characteristics of another gender. Well, I think that anyone who experienced gender dysphoria or who is trans will relate to that. Discomfort or distress at being treated as assigned gender at birth. Yes, it can absolutely cause distress. I've experienced it myself back when I was trans. So yeah, I can see that one. It's not far from the truth. It is correct. But then let's take a look at some that I think are absolutely ridiculous. Preferring toys typical of another gender. Now, that feels like such a step backwards. We are regressing as a society. Yeah, holy shit. Haven't we worked so hard to reject those gender norms? Like, saying boys can play with whatever they want, whatever toys they want. Girls can play with whatever toys they want. Now you're telling me that if a boy chooses to play with Barbies, or if a girl chooses to play with cars, then she's actually a boy? And the worst thing about it is there are some parents out there, usually mothers, who will try to be so tolerant, so accepting. They will try to virtue signal. And then they have a kid, they have a boy, and they see, oh, my boy likes to play with dolls. He must be a girl. And then they start to affirm that, right? Till the boy starts to believe in it. Hey, I was supposed to be born a girl. Why do we have to interfere in a child's natural development? Here's the thing, my thoughts here. Let your child play with whatever they want, let them dress however they want, but don't affirm anything. Let them find out on their own, in their own time. If they reach their adult age and they actually do feel gender dysphoria, fine, let them transition if that's what they want. But my advice is don't get the bloody surgery. That shit is really bad for you. And hormones come with a range of side effects as well. You have to be prepared to make that choice. It's not an easy choice to make. And for some parents, it's like a game. It's like, oh, I have a trans child. Ah, hooray for me!
My mom doesn't matter if I am gay or lesbian or any of that. She doesn't care. All she cares about is that I'm a part of it. And if I'm not a part of it, she'll try to convince me to join it. Cause
What are you saying right now?
Facts.
What about some other examples? Reject gender norms and stereotypes. A lot of people do that, let me tell you. A lot of gay people do that, and a lot of straight people do that as well. You know, it's not a sign of gender dysphoria. Neither is preferring clothes or hairstyles typical of another gender. A lot of people will experiment with their gender expression. There's nothing wrong with that. That does not give you gender dysphoria for that reason. This picture is just so messed up. You know what is a symptom of gender dysphoria? Actually genuinely disliking or hating your body for the characteristics of the sex it has. And feeling like you really want to be the other sex. Yeah, that's gender dysphoria. I can't believe I'm explaining something this simple, but apparently a lot of people out there don't understand it, and they think like, oh, if my kid plays with this, you must be a girl, yeah, sure. Now don't get me wrong, I absolutely understand why some trans people wouldn't want to call their dysphoria, or whatever you want to call it, as a mental illness or a symptom of mental illness. You know, especially like if you look at the past, if you go back to the 50s or so on, you'll notice that like a lot of trans people were treated as sick individuals. They were locked up in mental institutions, and I don't think that's a solution. And I think that by calling it a mental illness, we can sort of go down a slippery slope when we reach that point again. And I don't think that's what we should be aiming for. However, I propose that we look at mental illness very differently. You know, I think we have come quite long as a society, and we have more compassionate outlook towards people who are suffering from mental illness. So, well, where does that leave us? If we do not treat gender dysphoria as a mental illness, well, first of all, how do we treat it if we don't consider it a problem? And I think it is a problem. Anything that causes distress or suffering is a problem for a person experiencing that. And then again, you know, if it's not an illness of any sort, why should the hormonal treatment and surgery be paid for by taxpayers? All of that. If it's not an illness, then it's purely a cosmetic procedure. Now, I don't think a lot of trans people would be so happy about it. In fact, Hunter Schafer, she's a transsexual actress who played someone in a TV series called Euphoria. And I tried watching the first episode of that show. I thought it was horrible, to be honest. I didn't like it at all. I think it's borderline but I find this tweet of her quite interesting, and it points out everything I just said. I hope all of the people, NBAs, who fought to have trans identities no longer considered a medical condition that requires dysphoria are happy because you've won. The red states are beginning to agree with you. HRT and gender-affirming surgery are no longer deemed medically necessary for adults in Florida, and it's not going to stop there. That means more trans people will have to pay for their transitions out of pocket, forcing more of us into sex work. Y'all just couldn't stand to let binary trans people be the voice of this community. You had to dismantle all of the guidelines around being trans to fit your narrative so you could feel valid, and then you demonized trans people who challenge your ideals and called them true scum trans medicalists. What you don't understand is that binary trans women and men don't have the luxury of playing around with what it means to be trans the same way I do, the same way you do. You challenge gender ideologies from the safety of a cis body that requires no medical treatment. We have to play the game and live by the guidelines that cis people have created for us, because that is how we survive. You're not helping. You're not dismantling the gender binary. You're not expanding the minds of cis people. You are making them hate us. For the last time, I am begging non-binary people to take a seat and let binary trans people, and more specifically black trans women, be the voice of the community, because they are the ones at risk. I don't know if it's just me, but I think that the entire trans community is at war. You know, you have people like Buck Angels and Blair White on one side. Then you have people who would say that trans women are biological women. You have those who are totally like, oh no, non-binary is trans, you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans. And then there's the so-called trans medicalists, where like, you need to medically transition, you need to have dysphoria to be considered trans, blah, 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 blah. So I'm like, there is no such a thing as trans ideology. It's not a singular ideology of any sort, to be honest. I don't even think being trans is an ideology. It comes with certain ideological perspectives, and they are not always aligned. Let me tell you, they are not aligned at all. Personally, I think that a lot of people can live happily without taking hormones and without doing surgeries. Just expressing themselves in their natural way is enough for them to achieve some level of happiness and satisfaction in life. But a lot of them transition because of pressure. And it's either pressure from trans community, and sometimes it's pressure because, well, if you're not passing as a female or as a male, when you're expressing yourself that way. And I think there's especially a lot of stigma around it for males. Like if you choose to dress a certain way that is more feminine, you will be stigmatized for that, right? You will get a lot of shit from society for that. And that's what's forcing people to transition in the first place. Well, I mean, look what Iran is doing, it has been doing for a long time, right? Like in Iran, if you're gay, you will face pretty much a death sentence.
The way Iran likes to deal with it is by coercing gay individuals to have sex change operations. Now, this is really fascinating because they reject the idea of homosexuality. In fact, if you are caught in gay acts, you could be murdered in Iran. However, they do accept that if you want to date or marry or be with someone of the same sex, you could be having a gender identity crisis, and maybe you should go through with a sex change operation.
Here are your choices, right? You either get stoned, and not in a good way, or you get a sex change, right? You get a hormones, you get a surgery, so you can live as a straight woman now, or a straight man. Funny, we're doing something very similar in the West, though. Well, the intention is good, but look at the consequences. And now, I think there are some cases where just expressing yourself a certain way is not enough, where you have a need to go on hormones. Well, I think we should first and foremost treat that psychologically with therapy. And if that doesn't work, I think we should focus on actual medical transition. Like, I'm not against people transitioning medically, but I think there should be alternatives. I don't think there's one way to treat it, right? And another thing is, if we consider everything, absolutely everything, as gender dysphoria and trans just because, oh, you like to play with certain toys, here's the thing. When it comes to physical health, there's a lot of illnesses that have overlapping symptoms. Why don't we think of gender dysphoria or transsexualism in the same way? A little girl who's experiencing gender dysphoria and who's going to turn out to be trans will have a lot of overlap with a young girl who's a lesbian and will probably grow up to be a butch. That's why my idea is that we should not interfere in a child's development and let them find out that naturally. Don't put ideas in their head. Don't do that. So one more time, I don't think that gender dysphoria being a mental illness is a slur or insult of any sort. In fact, it's actually quite helpful because it helps you understand where the issue lies, right? And I don't think we should treat anyone any differently because of their mental illness. I will never treat anyone with bipolar disorder any different. And I would never ever treat anyone who has gender dysphoria or is trans any different. If you think of that mental illness as a slur, as a negative thing, I think that says more about your view of mental health. I'm all about destigmatizing mental health. I think that's the way we should move forward. Anyway, I will see you in the next video, probably next week. And till then, I hope you have a good day, I hope you have a good week, and take care of yourself. Ciao.